KTAR News Special, featuring Mac and Gaydos. Live reaction from local newsmakers and from you to President Obama's town hall meeting on KTAR News, 92.3 FM, and streaming live on the KTAR News app.
If you're just joining us, you missed a great town hall. The President of the United States held a town hall meeting with a number of different people on race and police. It's Mac, it's Gaydos. Also joining us is an ASU professor of English, specializing in African-American literary and cultural studies. We welcome Dr. Neal Lester to the show as well. We thank you so much for taking the time out today and joining us.
Absolutely, an important conversation.
Absolutely. With what happened in Dallas, what happened in Minnesota as well as Louisiana, it's a good time to, I don't want to say reflect because that's a word that I think is overused, but really think about where we are in this country when we have elected the first black president. We have made forward progress in race relations, yet we were reminded last week of there are people who think that there are enemies. People are enemies, cops are our enemies, whomever.
Yeah, how do we get past the us versus them?
Yeah.
That was something that was mentioned during the president's town hall on policing and race relations. The one thing that the president said, and he's continued to say, is our country is not as divided as it seems.
That bothers me.
It does.
That really bothers me. He's said it a couple of times now.
Why does it bother you?
Because I don't think it's true. I think we are divided. I think we have been divided. I think we will. I don't want to sound doom and gloom that we will always be divided. Okay. But I grew up in Baltimore. Outside of Baltimore, I should say, in lily white farmland, outside of Baltimore City.
Sure.
But I went to school with inner city kids who I know had a very different relationship with cops, with their community, than I did. And I don't know how you bridge that gap of the cops are the enemy because of the community, or I don't understand you, so why are you yelling at cops, or why don't you like cops? I don't know how we make that divide or conquer that divide.
Dr. Lester, are we as divided as it seems?
Well, one of the things you have to do is make sure that we're not trying to oversimplify situations and to try to compare, are we now more or less than we were before, potentially doesn't tease at nuances, because what we're talking about is how is that division manifesting itself. Because if you're talking, for example, about Jim Crow, that was a division there. If you're talking about American slavery, that's a division there. So I don't know if we're more or less, and I'm not even sure that that's the question we should be looking at. Are we more? The reality is that these are happening in pockets. This isn't happening in all of the streets, everywhere, in every community. What we are looking at is very specifically tied to a community, which was mentioned here, people without opportunity, without educational access, without jobs, who really have very little hope, the Fergusons. That's not necessarily the Awatukis. So when we're talking about this, let's not sort of imagine this as a broad brush to talk about are we more divided or are we less divided. The issue is what is before us and what can we do about what is before us so that we don't repeat what we just saw last week.
We were talking off the air just for a second. I was in Chicago over the 4th of July, and my wife and I were riding the L in the subway. And while all this was going on, the death in Louisiana and Minnesota of 2 black men, and then what happened on Thursday with the Dallas police. But it was, and we were talking about racial tension, yet everybody on the subway, I was sitting next to a black man, and we had a great conversation about his hat.
Right.
He told me, get rid of the Yankees hat. You need to put this hat on. And there was a black man that got up for a white woman and gave him his seat, and a white man who got up for a black woman and said, please have my seat. And I'm looking at this in Chicago, and Chicago's been very troubled by gun violence and gangs, and there are black people that are killing other black people. And I'm watching this in the subway, though, and I'm saying, you know what? I maybe we're not as divided as it seems. We're all getting along perfectly fine. There's no one
on the L
scared of each other. There's no one worried about each other, and maybe that's just in my kind of Pollyanna mind. I don't know.
But my sort of optimistic way of looking at this too is that most people are decent.
Yeah.
What we hear about are those people I like to think who are in the margins.
Yeah.
Everybody isn't driving through a crowd. What we hear about, however, are the ones who drive through the crowds. Everybody isn't a Dylan Roof who's going into South Carolina shooting up a church full of black folks.
Right.
So that's what you have to look at. It's what I mentioned off the air, too, is when a plane falls out of the air, there's so many people on a plane, and we imagine that this is dangerous to fly.
Yeah.
When actually it's more dangerous to get in a car and we see the number of people who are killed every day.
But it's the plane that scares us. It's that type of death that scares us.
This moment scares us.
Right.
Yeah. So in your estimation, Doctor, what did you think of the president? I was underwhelmed. I expected more dialogue. I expected, this is my point of view, we need to fix this. Instead, I thought it was rather light.
Well, let's look at the parameters of the expectations first. To have a big, bold, audacious topic like race in America, we could spend years talking about that and have spent years.
Oh, yeah.
So part of that is, what are our expectations? Did we come to a moment that we hadn't been to before this happened? And I think there were some things that are outlined. And I think as the leader of this country, he has an obligation to say something. And not just at a memorial service, but to say something. What was particularly interesting for me is the fact that there was this sort of narrative about the human family. Mm-hmm. The fact that no matter what our differences are, there's something about grief, he said, that is not different. So no matter what your color is, your race, your gender, there's something about grief. And we heard from the mothers of policemen who are afraid for their sons, in the same way that we hear from the mothers of those who have been otherwise victimized by a system. And I noticed also that he didn't necessarily try to place this on the backs of police. Looking at Ferguson, we recognize that it was not just the police who were sort of oppressing the people who were most vulnerable and voiceless, but also the municipal system. So there are lots of ways that this was actually a shout out to all of us when he talks about each one of us has bias. You connect that bias with power, and we create these systems of privilege. Once we acknowledge that, then we can stop saying, okay, so how do we move from here, instead of looking at how did we get here?
You're listening to Mac and Gaydos, a special edition of Mac and Gaydos, as we're basically talking about the town hall meeting that happened with the president between 5 and 6 o'clock. And it's one of those things where, do we need to discuss it? Absolutely. How do we discuss it? Does anything resolve itself? We're with also Dr. Neal Lester of ASU, a professor of English specializing in African-American literary and cultural studies. Dr. Lester's well-schooled as far as race, politics, African-American culture, and that's why we invited him here, too, because my experience is very different than Gaydos' experience, very different than yours, Dr. Lester, so we appreciate your time.
I wonder if the president speaking today for an hour, and it's not a press conference, and it's not a speech, it's a Q&A, it's a town hall, I wonder if the point of that is to try and make us all feel better. Is it to try and just kind of iron out a very troubled few weeks? Because we all can't understand what's taken place. Right. And I wonder if, part of his job is to help us heal. Did we get a lot of answers tonight? I thought we got a few. Yeah. But do you think, Dr. Lester, is it because did the president speak tonight to say, we're on this. We know it's a problem. I'm going to talk about it for an hour. We're not going to fix it in an hour. Right. We haven't fixed it in decades. So what was
centuries actually?
Centuries, exactly. So right. So if because he says things have been better. Right. Things have gotten better from his vantage point of being a young black man and being pulled over. He talked about it, or a white woman gets out of the elevator when he was in there as a kid.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about this is when we talk about this sort of getting at the humanity of this, I think he sort of, this town hall experience sort of puts a human face on these actions that we've had in the past few. So you can talk about violence sort of as being ubiquitous, but there's something about putting a human face on these experiences. So I actually saw way more personalizing when he started saying, I grew up as with a single mom. Yes, I have been stopped. Sometimes I deserved and sometimes I didn't. So there's this, and then when you have the mom speaking and Diamond Reynolds speaking, this is putting a face on the actions that we, so that we can't just sort of put these in a closet and say, well, I don't know what that is. It doesn't involve me.
Diamond Reynolds.
We know these people now. now.
Diamond Reynolds filmed the aftermath of the shooting with her boyfriend, Philando Castile.
Yeah. Well, and even the mom who gave her son a nice little spanking in front of us
in public in Baltimore.
Right. And he looked the part that I really don't want to do this, Mom, right now.
Some remember the African American woman who was dressed in yellow that saw her son on television at one of the I don't think
the
it was
school. It was the school, and they were going to go to the mall and start rioting. And they were dressed in black, and Mom recognized her son and took her son home and became Mom of the Year.
Right. And spanked him.
Yes.
Yes.
On camera.
Yeah. And I don't think that was advocating violence, but was to show the extent to which she, as a single mom, was trying to do the best that she could to keep her son safe. And in that context, he was not safe. He didn't know what he was doing. There was no real sense that he was connected to whatever was going on. He was just going on with the crowd.
Yeah. So what are we doing in Phoenix to keep cops safe, to keep people who are in their cars, if an African American is driving and they get pulled over? What are we doing in Phoenix to keep everybody safe? The mayor of Phoenix is going to join us to discuss that in a second.
This is a KTAR News 92.3 FM special presentation. Mac Gaydos with instant reaction to the president's town hall meeting.
Yeah, the president had a town hall meeting. We carried it live at 5 o'clock here on KTAR News. It went about 1 hour. It was about race relations, justice, policing, and it was an important conversation, an interesting conversation. Mac and Gaydos were joined by Dr. Neal A Lester from Arizona State University, and we were ending our conversation right before the news flash about Phoenix, Arizona, and trying to keep everybody safe, cops, people who are driving around. Joining us right now is the mayor of Phoenix, Greg Stanton. Mayor Stanton, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
We're doing great. We're having an important talk about race and policing. And my first question is, here in Phoenix, our Phoenix police officers do a great job. They work hard. Do you think they're doing a good job of keeping people safe? Do you think they're doing a good job of being trained? And when they have to pull over an African American, what we're doing here in Phoenix is right. What we're doing here in Phoenix is safe.
I would say the answer to that is yes on all counts. Our Phoenix police officers have done an incredible job. The president mentioned during the town hall tonight how crime around the country is reduced. It is certainly reduced here in the city of Phoenix. We've done so with fewer officers on the street than we've had because of a bad budget situation that we had for many, many years. We're hiring more officers now, but for a long period of time, we were not able to hire officers yet. Our crime rate is low within the city of Phoenix. We were just recognized nationally. We had the Attorney General here in Phoenix recognizing our department as one of 5 or 6 around the country that have engaged in best practices when it comes to police community relations. We're not perfect, but, man, our police department does a really, really good job under very, very difficult circumstances. It starts at the top. Chief Joe Yonner is great when it comes to police community relations. He takes it very, very seriously. And the new chief that we just hired, announced today, Chief Jerry Williams, she's from this community. She's from our city. She's from these neighborhoods. And she will continue in that great tradition of strong police community relations. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's a constant effort to improve. But, man, we started out with a pretty strong base here in Phoenix when it comes to strong trust within the community.
Mayor Greg Stanton's joining us. Dr. Lester, a question for the mayor.
Sure. Hi, Mayor. This is Dr. Neal A Lester here. I've got a question in terms of what specifics do you have in terms of these areas of improvement are you alluding to?
A couple things. First, we put in, during one of our worst budget times, millions of dollars in our budget to give every single officer 40 hours of training, meaning 40 hours are off the street. They had to be replaced with overtime hours from other officers, and they've got 40 hours of training, which included de-escalation training. It included training on working with diverse communities. It included training on interacting with people who might have mental illness. That's a commitment that almost no major city police department has been making over the last few years. In this year's budget, we just passed, we're going to have money for body cameras, body-worn cameras for every single patrol officer in the city of Phoenix. And for a big city with as many officers as we have, that is a significant commitment to our future. And then we have an ongoing effort, the Community Policing Trust Initiative, which is out in the community meeting right now with leaders from not only the African-American community, but in the Latino community and the Asian community, LGBT community, all of the diverse communities that we interact with, getting their best ideas about how we can improve. Because there's no one policy that was going to pass that's going to solve all these issues. It's got to be an attitude of always trying to improve. What more can we be doing to improve? And that's what I try to bring to the table. I know our police chief and our officers do, and that's why I think we've struck a pretty good balance here in Phoenix.
Phoenix Mayor Greg Stanton, thank you so much. We appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you so much. Thanks for covering this very important issue.
Not a problem. You know, the mayor brought up something I thought that was very important. Is that it's the community, whereas the Milwaukee police chief on the town hall said it feels like, and I'm paraphrasing, it feels like we're protecting black lives rather than everyone. Is that the key, do you think, Dr. Lester? Is that the key, that it should be everybody? We shouldn't just categorize or just stereotype and say, well, black lives matter or this community matters. It should be everybody.
Well, there are several areas that are being conflated now. What I wish the mayor had commented on were efforts beyond the police, because once again we're sort of tossing the responsibility onto the police when we're talking about systems that go beyond the police system, municipal system. What's being done throughout the whole city that could speak to these issues of equity. And he's absolutely right that bringing in an African-American woman certainly speaks to this issue of diversifying. But I'd also like to see across the country, not just in Phoenix, the demographics on each of these in terms of the gender and the race. Because people aren't necessarily policing their own communities. They are still going into other communities that are unlike them, so they really don't know the communities they are policing. So as to the Black Lives Matter, I'm always sort of interested and intrigued when people respond with this all lives matter, because historically that hasn't been the case. I mean, even if we talk about what's happening now in Dallas or what has happened, there's been a lot of focus on the lives of the police. Well, if we're talking about this notion that grief is the same for those who are lost, we're not talking about the lives of those two young men that some say precipitated this. So do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
We still place a value on whose life is
or a
lost.
higher value,
Right,
on
right,
others.
Right, and that's not a bad thing so much as we have to acknowledge that in this country all lives don't matter. In the same way that we talk about a justice system where if you go to Stanford and you rape somebody and you're found guilty, you can have 4 months.
Amazing.
Clearly, all lives don't matter. So this notion, I've heard, lots of analogies. You go into an AIDS walk or an AIDS rally and somebody shouts, "But I have cancer." It doesn't mean that cancer doesn't matter.
Right.
It means at that moment we're talking about AIDS.
Right.
They're not trying to out-oppress each other. So this notion of all lives matter is a bit hypocritical because it's true that all lives don't matter. And all lives haven't always mattered historically.
It's Mac Gaydos. Alongside is Dr. Neal Lester from ASU. We're going to continue this discussion until 7 o'clock tonight. When we return, we're going to talk about the history of the presumption that black people are dangerous. That was brought up during Obama's town hall.
Also the talk. He talked about the talk
Let's do
well.
That, yeah. And the Ferguson effect. Plus some of your phone calls, 277-KTAR. If you have a reaction to Obama's town hall, by all means, 602-277-KTAR. Stick around.
A KTAR News special featuring Mac and Gaydos. Live reaction from local newsmakers and from you to President Obama's town hall meeting on KTAR News, 92.3 FM, and streaming live on the KTAR News app.
Well, if you're just getting in your car, 6:33. Yep, it's Mac and Gaydos. We're sticking around a little late today because the president had a town hall. And it ran about an hour. We carried it live at 5 o'clock on KTAR News. It was about race relations. It was about policing. It's Mac. It's Gaydos. We're also joined by Dr. Neal Lester. He's been nice enough to hang out with us. He's from over at Arizona State University, a professor of English, specializing in African-American cultural studies. So let's play a clip from the president earlier today.
And I don't want a generation of young people to grow up thinking either that they have to mistrust the police or, alternatively, that the police who are doing a good job and out there taking care of their communities, that they're constantly at risk, not just from criminals, but also because the community mistrusts them. But because of the history of this country and the legacy of race and all the complications that are involved in that, working through these issues so that things can continue to get better is going to take some time.
Okay, so Dr. Lester, when are we going to get to the point where it's not us versus them? It's not part of the community thinks it's us versus them. Do police officers think it's us versus them? Do African Americans think it's us versus them when it comes to the police?
Yeah, I sort of think so. I mean, I've worked with some police locally, and I don't know if every does, but there is a sense that there's a we against us. But that happens in other systems too. The educated versus the uneducated, the fat versus the thin, the gay versus the straight. But there is a sense that trust is hard to build once you've seen patterns of distrust. And I think, in any relationship, there's a sense that trust has to be manifested in different ways. So this notion of the history, I think, is important, and that's one of the things that this country has not always talked about or dealt with. And I've been teaching African American literature and cultural studies for over 30 years, and there is this sense among many that if we stop talking about race, then it'll go away. It's sort of like the more you talk about it, the more you show us it's there. And
is that conscientious though, or is it just I have to raise my kids, I have to supply money for my family, I got to pay my bills, I don't have time, I just don't want to talk about it.
Well, but see, that's when we start moving into this notion of privilege, though, because as an African American father, I don't have the privilege of not talking to my son because I want him to be safe. So these conversations that people are saying that we're starting conversation, they're not starting among African Americans, particularly in certain demographics here, that people have always been talking about race.
But don't racial tensions go away if Mac and I, who are here and we're white, we don't have to identify ourselves as white, and you're sitting here and you're an African American? Isn't it better that we just sit here as human beings? Well, we're not white. We're white. You're black. We're all humans. Because
nobody doubts that.
No, but when you get rid of the titles.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to agree with you on that, because now it seems like you're moving into that area of I don't see color. I just see you as a human being. And if you're not
that's not realistic.
Well, you're not seeing who I am, because part of who I am is that I come with race.
Right.
And you come with your race. So our experiences with police will be very different. Yeah. I heard you say on this show you've never been stopped by or Bruce may have said this. I've never been stopped by police and had a moment where I felt fearful. Yeah. Well, you can't ask me that, because I have felt that.
I know.
And so for you to not acknowledge that suggests that you're not looking at something, if I'm stopped in Sierra Vista, which I have, it's because of what my hair looks like. I've got locks and I'm in Sierra Vista, so I'm a trespasser. So the questions that I get asked, even though I am speeding, is this notion, where are you from? What do you do? Where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from? I don't think you'd be asked 3 times, where are you from? So you can't just sort of imagine that we're colorblind. And first, that's an illusion to imagine.
It's not realistic.
It's not realistic. If I'm in a wheelchair, I'd like for you to acknowledge that I can't get up those stairs. So I'd like for you to find some way for me to do that.
That's a fair point. It's a fair point.
We heard the president talk about the talk.
Yes.
And there's a video out, which I think the host said has been viewed 35 million times. Right. When I was working in Virginia, I worked with a black man who had a son who was going to start driving, and he said, I purposely bought him a Volvo station wagon with a baby seat in the back to give him to drive. Am I a cool dad? Hell no. But I want him to be as opposite, and these are his words, gangsta, as the cops would imagine. So he bought him a very different car with the baby seat.
No baby.
With no baby.
Right.
So cops would not assume that, if I buy you a new Lexus and you're a young black male, you're a drug dealer. Right.
And my son has been stopped because of that.
Okay. Did you have the talk with him? Is that prevalent now with African Americans?
Absolutely. I have had the talk. In fact, I had written an op-ed piece about this because our son has some social anxieties, and so he used to wear a hoodie all the time. And this was before Trayvon Martin. And so we had to sit down with him and say, okay, you're a tall, 6'5", brown man.
Lucky.
And certain people, will make assumptions about you. And we have been called by police in some neighboring cities here because they saw him.
You personally were called by the police?
I have personally been called to come get our son because he was wearing a hoodie, and it was much too hot to be wearing a hoodie in the summer here.
So he must be hiding something.
He must be hiding something. You know what he had in his pocket? Googly eyes. Because he's a very fun, big, tall guy.
Yeah.
So there was nothing. They thought that he was doing a beer run. So there is something about this, and they claim that there was no sense of race associated with it. But it's interesting when I went in and sort of raised questions about why they had called, and they brought out all these pictures of criminals who were wearing hoods or hoodies. And I'm thinking, okay, so wearing a hoodie translates to being criminal. So that's what I'm saying, is that we can't sort of imagine that we're all sort of in this moment where we're seeing each other just as human beings, because I'm not acknowledging that if you need to reach something on this shelf, I can reach it in ways that you can't,
right,
Mac.
Right.
So that's not putting value on this. This
right.
is just saying I can do something you can't. You can do stuff that I can't. But when it comes to these notions where we're talking about systems where there are people who are this is the only organization that's authorized to use guns to kill people in order to stop them from doing stuff. No other organization is able to do that. We have a particular circumstance when it comes to police. And let's just say one other thing about history. One of the things that gets overlooked in terms of how I understand American policing is that police started, and somebody in the audience may correct me, started after slaves were emancipated. And the police weren't there necessarily to stop criminals. They were there to police blacks, which is one of the residuals that we have in terms of what the representation across the country looks like. Most of the police in this country look more like you than they look like me. So there is a historical sort of precedent that's still in place that has not been moved. And you may hire a Jerry Williams here, but there are other departments that don't have anybody that look like Jerry. And I'm talking about this in terms of race and gender. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about race.
So is part of the solution more African-American police? Because that's been talked about. The police chief in Dallas said, "Hey, we're hiring."
Right.
If
get off the protest line and
yeah,
we're hiring.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you think that would change anything?
Well, I think police need to look like the communities they police. So whether that is more African Americans or more Native Americans or more Asians, we need to have people who look like, so that they can therefore communicate and connect with those communities. That is not to say that others cannot. We see those viral videos where someone who is not necessarily looking like people in that community goes in and they're dancing with them, they're playing basketball with some of the people they serve, so they get to know them. But we're actually afraid of each other. We actually don't talk to each other. We're more interested in looking at our gadgets, letting down our garage doors. You know, we don't even meet at mailboxes anymore,
right,
because we get
right.
them out of slots and then we go back.
Right.
So there is a sense that we're more disconnected than we've ever been. And I think technology in some ways has contributed to that. It's certainly not the
so it doesn't have to be neighborhoods anymore.
Absolutely.
It can be technology, really.
Absolutely. So, you know, we talk at Project Humanities about talking, listening, connecting. And there are so many people who never talk to people. Even in class, I see that. You know, students come in right before class. They rarely talk to each other because everybody's on their
phones. Well, they're hungover. It's college.
Well, that I don't know. That I don't know. Right. That I don't know. But what I do know is that they don't talk. And all you've got to do is watch when class dismisses between classes, and you see that everybody is on a gadget.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Everybody's on a gadget.
Yeah.
So if you're on a gadget, it doesn't mean that you're not talking to somebody on this, but people are playing games.
Mm.
They are.
They're not interactive.
They're not in
I
the
have
real
somebody
world.
in my family who, and she's probably listening now, who's always playing that Candy Crush.
Mm-hmm.
No matter where we are, she's not even talking to me. She's playing Candy Crush.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining, you know, I certainly don't want to equate that with the gravity of what's happening, but if we're talking about being more disconnected, we really aren't talking to each other.
Right.
We don't know our neighbors.
We've got more on the way with Dr. Lester. Mac and Gaydos here until 7. Charles Barkley said something just yesterday that black people need to do better.
Oh, God.
Okay? So, boy, are we going to put you on the spot, and you're going to tell us what you thought of that, Dr. Lester. That's coming up next as we continue along talking about President Obama's very interesting town hall on race relations and policing.
This is a KTAR News 92.3 FM special presentation. Mac and Gaydos with instant reaction to the president's town hall meeting.
All right, so the president spoke for an hour. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a
it wasn't a rally. It wasn't a political rally.
There wasn't press there. It was him sitting really in the middle of a room, and there was an audience. And it was a town hall, and it was about race, and it was about policing.
And a very specific audience.
Correct. Yeah. It was an audience of people who have been affected by cops being killed, or their son or daughter or mother or father being killed by a police officer. And we're being joined by Dr. Lester from ASU. I told you I would bring up Charles Barkley.
Yes.
Charles Barkley said this yesterday about how black people need to do better.
I've always said, we as black people, if you want respect, you have to give each other respect. You can't demand respect from white people and the cops if we don't respect each other. So we got to do better as black people.
What does he mean, Dr. Lester?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm not in his head, so I can't say what he means. But Charles always says stuff that's pretty provocative. But I will say that feels a little bit like blaming the victim on that.
Really?
You know, if you tell a rape victim she shouldn't have been wearing this or he shouldn't have been doing this,
right.
You don't have to do anything to be respected. I think what you do is you do something and then people can feel that you're being disrespectful. But I think that makes things really murky when you start saying you should be more respectful. And you know, I'm always stunned, too, when people go to this black-on-black crime, when we're talking about an issue that is really about systemic racism, where we're talking about a system in this country that is called white supremacy. If we're talking about people who are in positions of power, and this has nothing to do with President Obama because he is one person, and we've seen what can happen to him as a first. All kinds of disrespect that we haven't seen in other presidents, finger wagging of people in the state and, you know, you lie in congressional meetings. So there is a history that we have to acknowledge. And I think until we sort of acknowledge that there is a problem there, we can't sort of move toward addressing it.
So Charles Barkley is outspoken, but
Yes.
I wonder how many people also take him seriously because he does say outrageous things. But the one thing that at least resonated with me is said, you've got to respect yourself first. Right. How can you ask for respect when you don't show any respect? I do think he has a point there.
Well, but I don't know that if we talk about what happened in these last two episodes, that they had anything
Minnesota?
to do with whether or not somebody respected themselves. So I don't see how that's really relevant to somebody being shot in your car in South Carolina. You know, the guy who's running from the police and he's shot in the back. What does that have to do with whether or not you respect yourself?
Yeah,
we've got about a minute
Good
left. Final thoughts on the president today with his town hall. My takeaway quickly was it's not every day that the president can get together on television and radio with people who have been affected by something like this, and I believe that it made it more personal. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Mac,
I would agree.
Mac,
I agree.
your takeaway from today?
I thought it was a little light. I was underwhelmed, but as the good doctor here has explained to me, it's not going to be a magic pill. It's not going to be a magic wand, but at least it was a discussion. I'm glad it was a discussion, and I'm glad he didn't make it political. I'm glad he didn't finger point or make it political at all.
Dr. Lester, you got about 20 seconds.
Yeah,
What's your
I think we can do exactly what we're trying to do at ASU with Project Humanity. It's to create a movement called Humanity 101. It's not a course, but rather it's a focus on compassion and empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, self-reflection. How can we make these things sexy?
And we're going to put that on our Facebook fan page as well as Twitter. We'll tweet that out later.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that the president, if anyone today could have thought that they were going to fix it in an hour, it goes back to what you said. It's expectations. The president answered questions. There were people there that were, asking him certain and, sometimes very difficult questions.
Right.
But I'm glad we can have this discussion. I'm glad we heard him at 5 o'clock and we were able to take another hour and talk about it.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Lester, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
And we'll have you on the show again, certainly.
Please do. Thank you so much.
All right, until next time.
All right, great to have Mac and Gaydos on the show. We'll see you tomorrow.